Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're tackling something pretty heavy, but absolutely fascinating. We're exploring an incredibly profound question. How on earth do fractured societies actually attempt to heal and rebuild after experiencing profound historical trauma? I want you to imagine a scenario for a second. Imagine a country that has just survived a brutal civil war or a terrifying dictatorship. The violence has officially ended, right? But the people who burned their neighbors' homes or turned them over to the secret police, they still live in the exact same towns. You still have to stand in the same lines at the local grocery store as them. How do you even begin to navigate that? When a nation goes through a deeply painful period, just sweeping it under the rug simply doesn't work. So to avoid these endless, ongoing cycles of revenge, many countries have turned to a specific mechanism known as Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. We're going to look at the global framework of these commissions and see how unearthing really hard truths is used to pave the way for actual, sustainable national healing.
Here's our structural roadmap for today. We'll start by defining what these international mechanisms actually are. Then, we're going to do a comparative analysis of 3 distinct real-world applications in South Africa, Rwanda, and Canada, before wrapping up with what the future of reconciliation might look like globally.
Okay, let's dive right into Section 1. What are truth commissions, and what happens when traditional justice just isn't enough?
It's a massive, critical question. How does a fractured nation heal? When state-sponsored abuse absolutely shatters a country's foundation and its trust, how does society avoid total, ongoing collapse? Naturally, we tend to think of traditional courtrooms and prisons as the answer to crime, but consider the logistics after a mass atrocity. If a new government tries to arrest, try, and lock up hundreds of thousands of its own citizens for past violence, the entire infrastructure and economy of the state would just completely collapse. I mean, the court dockets alone would take centuries to clear. Traditional courts simply cannot handle that sheer scale of trauma, which is exactly why a new approach became an absolute logistical and social necessity.
Enter the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC. According to the Rule of Law tools from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, a TRC is an official body set up specifically to discover and reveal past wrongdoings. And these aren't just ad hoc ideas thrown together in a panic. They are internationally recognized legal architectures. The ultimate goal here isn't just to look backward. The objective is to document the truth meticulously. It gives victims a permanent public record of their suffering so that these atrocities are exposed and, crucially, prevented from ever recurring in the future.
But moving from traditional courts to these commissions requires a massive philosophical shift. We're moving away from purely punitive justice, which is what we see in traditional courts and prisons. Punitive justice basically asks 2 very specific questions. What law was broken, and how do we punish the offender? That's your standard model. Restorative justice, on the other hand, flips the script completely. It asks, who was harmed, and how do we repair that harm? It's a totally different lens through which to view justice. Commissions focus heavily on truth-telling, giving victims a real voice and prioritizing societal healing over simple punishment. Let's move to our first major case study in Section 2, South Africa. We'll look at the TRC blueprint and how the nation transitioned past apartheid. So to avoid a catastrophic civil war at the end of the apartheid era, South Africa established its TRC mandate. It was championed by iconic figures like Nelson Mandela and led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. They delivered their foundational Volume 1 report in October 1998. But the process certainly didn't just stop in the 90s. That initial report kicked off what is now an ongoing 28-year legacy. And when we say ongoing, we mean things happening right now, like victim reparations, memorialization, and the continued investigations into missing persons cases by the Department of Justice today.
Now, the crucial point of the South Africa model was this unprecedented, frankly radical mechanism. The Commission offered politically motivated perpetrators amnesty, utter freedom from prosecution, in direct exchange for uncovering the absolute, unfiltered truth of what they did. You can imagine how agonizing this moral compromise was. Picture being a victim's family, sitting in a room and watching the person who murdered your loved one walk completely free simply because they confessed to the crime. It's a heavy, heavy societal burden, but it was designed this way to unearth facts, locate bodies, and piece together truths that otherwise would have been literally taken to the grave.
In the 1998 report, the chairperson wrote that this was, quote, the painful but necessary first step to reconciling the victims and perpetrators. That sentiment really captures the heavy reality of the whole process. The disclosure of these horrific truths, as excruciating as it was for families to sit there and hear, was viewed as that mandatory first step. Without the truth laid bare for the entire country to see, acknowledge, and put on the historical record, genuine reconciliation was considered completely impossible.
Next up, we examine Section 3, Rwanda, Grassroots Community Justice, addressing the 1994 genocide.
The violence here was fueled by deep pre-colonial and colonial ethnic divisions, and it demanded a totally different approach to justice compared to South Africa. Instead of a formal, central national court system housed in some grand building in the capital, Rwanda utilized what are called the Gacaca courts. Gacaca literally translates to on the grass. This was a return to traditional grassroots community justice, and the visceral reality of these 4 steps is striking. The community gathers right there at the local village level. Victims sit literally face-to-face with the people who harm their families outside in the open air without any high-priced lawyers. Perpetrators confess or defend their actions, and local community judges issue the sentence right there on the grass. Now, consider this staggering number: over 1 million cases. Take a second to process that. This localized village-by-village method managed to process well over 1 million cases. To really understand why this was so necessary, contrast it with the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the traditional international court set up by the UN. That traditional tribunal spent over 20 years and over $1 billion just to convict roughly 60 ringleaders. The Grassroots Gacaca approach processed 1 million everyday people in a fraction of the time. The contrast is highly insightful. It proves that when traditional infrastructure fails, localized community justice is a matter of absolute necessity.
Let's transition over to Section 4, Canada, ongoing calls to action in the Indian residential school system.
This Truth and Reconciliation Commission focused not on a single concentrated violent event, but on long-term generational drama. The Canadian TRC culminated in 94 very specific calls to action targeting major systemic areas: child welfare, education, health, language and culture, and justice. To ground this in reality, let's look at just one. In child welfare, a specific call to action focuses on reducing the disproportionate number of Indigenous children in the foster care system, demanding that social workers are actually properly educated on the history and impacts of residential schools. This comprehensive guide was designed to facilitate real generational healing. It sparked real movement too, prompting provinces like British Columbia to begin outlining specific legislative changes regarding Indigenous rights within their own jurisdictions.
However, revealing the truth is really only the first part of the battle. According to an October 2025 analysis by the Brock Press, a full 10 years after the TRC released its final report, a significant majority of these promises of reconciliation remain pending. Only a minority have been fully completed. When we contrast Canada's ongoing bureaucratic struggle to implement systemic changes with South Africa's ongoing legal struggles regarding missing persons, a pretty clear theme emerges. Truth-seeking is vital, but it doesn't automatically guarantee immediate, sweeping action.
This brings us to our conclusion in Section 5, the future of reconciliation. After looking at these distinct historical examples, what should you really take away from these diverse approaches to national healing?
When we look at these global approaches side by side, we see how a singular goal, restorative justice, adapts to completely different cultures and historical traumas. South Africa addressed apartheid using the agonizing but necessary amnesty for truth exchange. Rwanda addressed the 1994 genocide by utilizing grassroots open-air Gacaca courts to process an unprecedented volume of cases. And Canada addressed the legacy of residential schools through 94 distinct systemic calls to action. The core goal of truth remains exactly the same across the board, but the cultural mechanisms are entirely unique to the society in need.
So, we'll leave you with this final thought to ponder. Considering the pending bureaucratic promises in Canada, and the complex, decades-long legal legacy still playing out in South Africa, can a nation ever fully heal? Is justice a final destination that a country eventually arrives at and just crosses off a list? Or is reconciliation simply an ongoing, everyday choice that a society must continuously make? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep seeking the truth.